Well, thank you all for coming. It is a real pleasure to have Professor Arnaud Kurze here with us. Arnaud Kurze is somebody who I've collaborated with for more than a decade. Arnaud was doing his kind of PhD research in Zagreb on the Regional Truth Commission initiative. And I was back in Zagreb at the time doing some research as well myself. And ever since then have been collaborating with Arnaud on a number of projects, including things like the Summer School on Transitional Justice, but also publications. And that's what brings us here today is the latest collaborative effort that involves also a couple other scholars, Lauren Velasco and Melissa Garnsey, who unfortunately could not make it to Tokyo for this. So just as a short word of introduction, Arnaud Kurze is Associate Professor of Justice Studies at Montclair State University. He is also director of the Project Barrows Lab, a collaboration between Montclair and the Wilson Center to promote innovative research, experimental learning, and digital literacy. His scholarly work on transitional justice in the post-Arab Spring focuses primarily on youth activism, art, and collective memory. Dr. Kurze is currently a global fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C., studying youth resilience in North Africa and the Middle East. He has published widely in academic journals, contributed to edited volumes, and is author of several reports on foreign affairs for governments and international organizations. Dr. Kurze is co-author of Mapping Queerness in Times of Uncertainty, published just this year, 2025, Justicecraft, Imagining Justice in Times of Conflict, published in 2024, and Mapping Global Justice, Perspectives, Cases, and Practice in 2022. He's also the co-editor of the book New Critical Spaces in Transitional Justice, Gender, Art, and Memory, published in 2019. He's given many interviews on a variety of topics, including bridging the gap between theory and practice in global justice, the politics of collective memory in the United States and beyond, LGBT issues in the Middle East, and Tunisia's democratization process, among others. He has been a recipient of many awards, fellowships, including currently you are a Kluge Fellow as well at the Library of Congress and a Fulbright. So welcome to Tokyo International University, Arnaud. It's a pleasure to have you here to talk to us and introduce this framework of Justicecraft, which is just as a word of introduction, is a kind of framework for studying justice. So,
thank you so much. So again, welcome everybody, and thank you for inviting me. It's really a pleasure and honor to be here. I'm very grateful for Professor Lamont as well as Tokyo International University to be here and to share this, as Chris mentioned, collaborative work that is actually the fruit of a long process. So as you can imagine, and prior to this talk here, some of you were asking me how research comes about. And as I mentioned, oftentimes research is an organic process. And so before I jump right into explaining a bit more closely what Justicecraft is, I just want to say a few words in terms of how the process itself came about. And so, as Chris mentioned, the idea of transitional justice, so the work and the study of how societies deal with past wrongdoings in post-conflict, but also in post-authoritarian contexts, deal with sort of the transition, the process of political, social, and also oftentimes cultural and or institutional change, is something that has fascinated science and the social sciences for quite a while, whether that is in terms of political scientists, sociologists, human rights activists, or historians, of course. And so this whole process has, in terms of transitional justice, been kicked off, especially in the 90s, with the end of the Cold War. And the implosion of the Soviet Union really brought out political science scholars to really dig into why is it that we were not able to capture what was happening, right? No one really was able to predict the implosion of the former Soviet Union and then the domino effect that it had, right? And so when we think about this, this was then a moment where scholars, especially legal scholars, then decided it's really, really important to think about how then societies and these post-Cold War regimes deal with sort of the atrocities, the repression, and the injustice that occurred during the years of the Iron Curtain. And so there were a lot of, as I mentioned, legal scholars and or political scientists that were fascinated by the institutional change, right? And so what we've seen, however, though, when we look into the mid-1990s, is really this idea of the Balkan Wars. We've all read or heard about the genocide in Rwanda, right? That was also the mid-90s. And so despite Fukuyama's sort of end of history, end of man story, where liberalism, neoliberalism, right? American capitalism as the way of life that actually leads us into this new millennium was flawed, right? So you still have local conflict, you still have atrocities that were occurring. And so when we think about this accountability mechanism, the International Tribunal for sort of crimes in the former Yugoslavia and or in Rwanda were set up in 1993. When we take Yugoslavia, for instance, the genocide in Bosnia and Herzegovina happened in 1995, right? And shortly thereafter, you had the Dayton peace agreements, right? And so, again, even though we had an accountability mechanism set up right around that time, you did not, the international community was unable to prevent these atrocities. So it was sort of justice for peace, and this did not quite work. And so I could mention a number of events where that was the case, where these scholars, legal scholars oftentimes, but also political scientists, were really trying to find mechanisms of how we can actually deal with these past problems. And Chris mentioned earlier that I did my PhD work in the Balkans on a truth commission effort or an initiative. It was called Conceptualizes. So this was an effort, a trans-regional effort that included the Serbian side, the Bosnian side, the Croatian side, and a few other states that were basically dismantling the former Yugoslavia at the time, and that became independent states, and that were trying to deal with the war and the civil conflict. I mean, for some scholars, it's a civil conflict because it was the former Yugoslavia, the Federal Republic, that fell apart, right? But because you have the emergence of nation states afterwards, for historians and also for people like human rights activists working on this topic, it became an international conflict because of the notion of state sovereignty and nation state systems that emerged in that region, right? And so when you think about this, when I was on the ground doing my field work, interviewing these human rights defenders, trying to create that truth commission over the years. So I started, the effort started in 06, 05, 06. I was on the ground, I was there around 08, 09, and all the way to 2012 when I perfected my PhD. And never did I ever see the Truth Commission in existence. So it was quite imagine. I was like, every day I talk to the participants and the stakeholders, and they're like, yeah, it will be happening next month. It will be happening in 3 months from now. We have more meetings. And so you as a PhD student, right, happily on your dissertation, and you're like, so where's my Truth Commission, right? And so you can imagine that for a moment, you also have an existential crisis, right? Because you're writing about a Truth Commission that's not there in existence, right? And so eventually, I managed to write about the process. What have people, societies, and the stakeholders, these participants, learned through that process, right? It was the unsuccessful Truth Commission story that I was telling, but my glass is always half full. So I was trying to, through my participant observations and through my interviews, tell a story that would help these societies, whether it's a government, whether it's a civil society organization, whether it's society, the community at large, try to help understand what is going on and how we deal with it. And so you can see by these few examples that are here mentioned in my introductory remarks that transitional justice in and of itself is quite a tricky process and quite a tricky field of study. And so it's received by also some competition afterwards. The legal scholars that really were pushing for human rights trials, or trials as a mechanism and form to deal with the past, was flanked, of course, by these more restorative practices, truth commissions, and or storytelling, oral history projects, to really try to make sense of the past, and also have a way of recording these atrocities or these injustices done against certain groups, right? But oftentimes they lack a really holistic approach. They were siloed or they were just one side, right? And so that's where we come in here with this idea of justice. Right? And if you look at it, and I bet you, Professor Lamont and other instructors that you have here on campus, when they introduce a topic, they will first and foremost hammer out definitions, right? They will say, like, you need to understand what the perspective, what the core idea is of a term, of a concept. And when we look at this here, Justicecraft, you can see that it is a composed word, combining justice and craft, right? When we think of the word craft, I think a lot of us will think of craftsmanship. Crafting implies some sort of art, and you've all, for those who've done at least political science, come across Machiavelli and sort of the art of doing politics, right? When you think of 19th century politics, especially in Europe with the Iron Chancellor Bismarck, right? It was sort of this realpolitik as crafting and really forging a new empire, the German federal state eventually, right? And so it is a form of art where one has to weigh one's option, right? Doing sort of a cost-benefit analysis. And so this is after many, many years of thinking about transitional justice, of thinking about human rights and democratization processes. We got some money at the International Studies Association with Chris and I just came back from in Chicago. The annual conference was held there earlier last month. And so we got together a handful of scholars that were like-minded and that also thought that the current concept and the field of study of transitional justice didn't do justice, and no pun intended here, to the broader ramifications of past wrongdoings in society. And so we put our heads together and we decided, what is it and how can we create a different framework that could allow us to better understand what is going on the ground. And so we wanted to underline the process character of any wrongdoing, of any sort of atrocity that occurred and that still affects the society, whether that's repression, whether it's political violence, a conflict, or an autocratic regime. And we wanted to really capture the multi-dimensional framework. And so we wanted to go beyond anything that exists thus far. And hence, we came up with this idea of, think of building a house. When you build a house, you don't only need the mason, the carpenter, and anyone that then does the interior design eventually, but you also need the designer, the architect, right? So you need to think about also where you're going to build your house. If you build it on a hill, if you build it next to the water, right? It's like this foresight. What does it mean? So you need to have a certain knowledge in where your craftsmanship, your process driven efforts are anchored. And you also then, as I mentioned, in terms of the architect, the carpenter, and others, you also need a skill set to implement this, right? And then, of course, it comes with the actual process of great building, right? And so for that really includes the labor, the process of laboring over your house here, if we take that same metaphor. But as you can imagine, when you build, whether that's an artist, whether that's a blacksmith, whether that's a carpenter, when you build, you really put your heart into your work, right? And so eventually, so that the people that inhabit the house can enjoy it, right? You can see the feng shui of certain buildings, right? Sometimes you walk into something, you feel good. It actually elevates your spirits. And other times you might be depressed. The room doesn't have a window, right? Or it looks all gray versus a very colorful wall. And so this idea of emotional affection, right? And so we call it affect as an element, a core element of our concept of justice. And so the last part that we use in terms of our conceptual framework, and here you see all the elements, and I'll say a few words in addition here, but the last part is really that in order to make justice and the process of dealing with accountability, with collective memory, with the consequences of the effects of an injustice, be it repression, be it again violence, political, structural, or very physical and individual basis, right? Is this element of materiality, right? So oftentimes, when you think of a process, we have seen many monuments built after war, right? There were a period where we were really putting up a lot of monuments that would honor generals. It was all about war and name. And when you think about later processes, especially in post-World War II memory politics, you see a lot of more victim-centered monuments, where the builders, the creators or designers of these monuments, either have put up more abstract monuments that would then leave a bit more up for interpretation, and or that would specifically highlight certain victims, right? And so one of them, for instance, and for those who might have had the chance to go to Germany, if you haven't been there, it's certainly worthwhile. In Berlin, there's a number. They have a whole museum island in Berlin, but there's a couple of monuments that really are striking. When we think about the Holocaust, there's one Holocaust memorial. You might have seen pictures of it. Some of you have had the chance to travel there, but it's made up of a lot of different sized pillars. Some of them very short, others like as tall as 10, 12 meters high, that are very, very oppressive, and they're domineering the entire landscape. And it's built on a sort of rolling hill space, an area next to in the vicinity of the Brandenburg Gate, right? And so, but it's a very abstract monument to honor the 6 million Jews that perished during the Nazis. But again, the 6 million Jews were not the only victims, right? And so there were gypsies and Roma that were persecuted, other political prisoners, and there were gays and lesbians. And of course, today when we talk about the queer community, we talk also about a broader approach, LGBTQAI+. But at the time, the word transgender didn't exist, right? So that even though there were already transgender operations at the time and in a very forward-thinking space, I think what was quite interesting is generally the transgender folks would refer to themselves as cross-dressers, right? And so in terms of memorializing the persecutions against these groups, there's really was a strong push from gay men, from the gay community. And there was even within the queer community tension between the lesbians and the gay men, because the gay men felt lesbians were not as persecuted as gay men. And so to think about this third or fourth element that I mentioned earlier, affect, the emotions, it's quite interesting to think that even within victim communities, you have sort of a competitive victimhood, right? The Jewish Council in Germany that was very instrumental in putting up the Holocaust memorial here, for instance, was very adamantly against the Roma and or the gay community getting their separate memorial. They said, like, no, even though this was sort of inaugurated as a monument for a large population that perished during that regime, it stands for all the victims. You can imagine in a time where in the last few decades where we were really individually driven to create voices for those who are oppressed or that can't be visible, there was an uphill battle from these communities. And just, I don't want to linger too much on this topic, but I think it's very striking because we see these types of struggles today still. And just imagine when the Allies came into the concentration camps, they really freed the remaining Jews that were in there. And they were free. They were free to go. But when they freed the gay folks in these concentration camps, they had to hide again. They could not go out in the streets and hold hands or kiss, right? And so they were actually put into jail. So they were freed by the liberators or by the Allies to only then be put back into jail by the German police of the German, basically Federal Democratic Republic, right? So it's from the Nazi regime, we go into a democracy only to lock up these people again. And so you see how difficult that is for a specific community, right? And so I want you to think in these terms. And so when we look at this concept of Justicecraft, neither of these elements is sort of dominating. It's not as if you need to have that knowledge about an atrocity first and that knowledge about how we can deal with this. Or whether it's the skill to really then bring people together to have reconciliatory efforts, right? And so I think here it's really, really important to think about these elements as fluid and as sort of an amalgam of different ways of how the process can begin and can get started and then also be sustained, right? There might be processes where affect is really, really important, right? Where the emotions, emotional charge, whether that's positive or negative, plays a crucial role. And this is certainly true when we think about the role of art. And so here I want to bring in a more recent example, and we'll fast forward here in time, but again, this conflict also started in the 50s, late 40s, 50s, and I'm talking about Colombia. And they had a peace agreement in 2016, and what I want to mention here is this project, this art project that really hones in on this idea of materiality, because what you see here on the floor is 37 tons of rifles that were transformed into floor tiles. And so the visitors, as you can tell, are literally walking over the past violence here. And so you see this combination between materiality, right? The physicality of like the rifles that people that now are trying to deal with this, either Colombians themselves or someone that's interested in this, right? And so earlier I also mentioned the process oftentimes requires a lot of labor. And so here, the labor refers to sort of 60 women survivors that survived that physical violence during that process. And they're really physically hammered these rifles into these tiles, right? So I think this is sort of like a process where they then link memory, mourning, and creating something new, right? And so if you look closely at this, you also see some paraphernalia hanging on top of this, right? And so this La Gran Violencia that started in the 50s and ended with the peace agreement is sort of superposed by also a much larger history and memory process, that namely of the conquistadores, right? In Colombia, as its name from Christopher Columbus, of course, right? And so you see how the creators and those who thought of dealing with this past memory brought in layer after layer, right? And so I think whether it's coloniality / post-coloniality that goes into a more modern conflict is certainly something to be aware of and bring into that process, right? And so I think in terms of thinking about transitional justice, about ongoing processes, I think you might have, for those who have dealt with human rights issues and transitional justice, for those for who that concept is completely new, I'd say it's certainly something when you think about peace and conflict studies, you think about peace building. So it's peace building on steroids, right? Because you're trying to go beyond. I mean, it's an inclusive peace building, but it's reflective about what happened in the past, right? And to cite William Faulkner here, right? The past is never dead. It's always present because the Germans even created a lovely word for those who have come across the German language. I'll bring up a tongue twister here, Vergangenheitsgenetik, right? It's like Germans are very logic, so they basically put these words together and you can have long words, but they're very rational, and for those who study the language, won't find trouble sort of making sense out of this. But so in other words, Vergangenheit is the past, and Bewältigung is to overcome, right? So that's what we say in English is dealing with the past. But here we have also a scholar, more recent scholar, Mascole, who coined the term Gegenwartsbewältigung. And Gegenwart is not the past, it's the present. So go back to Faulkner, right? You see how poetry or literature already deals with these things in a different realm, in a different space. And in terms of Germany, what really is interesting here, you can imagine how Germany oftentimes is labeled as a supermodel in terms of dealing with it, because they've had a number of trials, and then, of course, they also had the reunification process. And if you recall properly, right, during the separation between East and West Germany, lots of folks lost their lives due to the political regime, but also due to trying to flee the oppression in the East. And so there were a lot of trials afterwards, after unification, against the soldiers that actually shot anyone that tried to flee the regime. And so Germany has done multiple efforts and attempts in terms of coming to terms with past, right? And so to get back to sort of this dealing with the present, you probably recall Syria's conflict, the civil conflict. And so it was right around 2015 when, and for those who are in social media, right, that's quite also interesting. Think about, you have an aide. At the time, you had Angela Merkel being the chancellor. And so she had an aide that said, we are an immigrant nation. So meaning we welcome refugees and immigrants, right? And so this was a long debate in Germany. You've probably heard of the guest worker programs, right? So even though Turkish and other workers were part of the country, they never got the acknowledgement and recognition that they're part of Germany. It was only in the mid-90s where these public debates came up, right? And so when this came up, it went viral. So the Age just had a little post on, I think it was Twitter at the time, and all of a sudden the chancellor had to say, yes, we're welcoming Syrian refugees. And all of a sudden, lo and behold, you had 800,000 yen, you had 1.2 million Syrian refugees who settled in Germany because of one tweet, right? And so just imagine that, right? So think it going viral, you get views on YouTube, you get views on any social media platform, right? But this, and just to give you a glimpse of what that process entailed, it was quite striking. So in terms of Germany, which is a country with 80 million people, 1 million people is just a drop in the bucket, right? Take Lebanon, for instance, right? Direct neighbor of Syria, right? They had a third of their population. They had 2 million people, 2 million Syrian refugees in the country. Of course, they weren't always there permanently. They'd come and go, get their jobs done, go back to Syria if the situation was a bit calmer, right? It's true that the cultures are very similar, right? They're neighbors. The cultural difference between Germans and Syrians could be starker, right? And so there's definitely tension at the beginning in terms of the refugees getting settled. And if you, as a politician, think about governance structures, right? Bring in someone, for instance, and say, oh yeah, we got space here in rural Bavaria. We have a little community or a little township with 500 people. Let's just put up maybe 10 cities, and or we might have space, real estate, right, where we have gymnasiums or some factory buildings that we could use as temporary housing. And then all of a sudden, the town becomes a city of like 2,000 people, right? And so I think you can probably imagine that that might cause some friction between the local populations and the folks that get settled there, right? But overall, I think the Germans managed relatively well to integrate this despite sort of tensions that occurred. But what really was the toughest part is in the aftermath. You can imagine that anti-Semitism was always called upon in Germany, and you had a strong education system in terms of dealing with the Holocaust, right? It was ingrained in the educational system. But the new variable that was added to the equation here was now you had Syrian refugees that were anti-Semitic, right? Because of what was going on in the Middle East. And so now the German authorities, especially the education system, had to think about how do we deal with this? So you had to teach the Syrian refugees about the Holocaust, right? In a way that made sense with the present issues and political tension in the Middle East, right? So you see how regular or more traditional or conventional forms of transitional justice are really tricky when you think in terms of Nuremberg trials. We're dealing with the past of World War II, and we're dealing with a specific conflict. because there's so many different layers. So this is why our concept of Justicecraft is so helpful and so useful, because it's a way of really unpacking complex and multidimensional, multi-layered problems that you can then, based on these 5 elements that I mentioned earlier, you can really jump in and have a bit more of a holistic and dynamic approach. And so I think it really complements, we're not substituting transitional justice. We're not saying transitional justice is bad. Please use the concept of Justicecraft. But what we're really advocating for is a bit more flexibility depending on your approach, depending on how you want to address the past wrongdoings, right? You can focus on different stakeholders. Some folks prefer to really center on the victims, but again, it's important to center on the victims, but you can't understand the victims and how this pans out if you don't also look at other stakeholders, whether that is the government or the private sector and or the NGO or civil society sector. And all of these stakeholders have different aims. They have their raison d'etre, what their reason for existing is also key in terms of better understanding why something works or why something doesn't work. And so I want to maybe sort of close in the next 5 minutes on something that probably has also really been on your guys' minds, not only perhaps in the classroom, right, where teachers say like, don't use Gen AI, don't use ChatGPT for your texts, and right. But again, similarly to our smartphones, and or when Wikipedia emerged as sort of like a form of public and shared and collective knowledge, similar to that, AI, artificial intelligence, is here to stay, right? And so we need to deal with it in one way or another. And transitional justice studies, or sort of anything that deals with past injustice, has also not been spared of that new technological impact, right? And so I think what's important here is really to think about what that means in terms of the future when you think about collective memory, when you think about accountability. AI is certainly okay when we think about these algorithmic sort of trends, and it's almost like a black box, right? It's like oftentimes when you have a software that is run through AI, be a tool where we can actually say, yes, this tool will help accountability efforts. It may very well be helpful for someone that is trying to get more information about a vast amount of atrocity. The case of Syria, for instance, right? AI can really help in order to map all these wrongdoings if you have the tools that help you. But you have to be aware of who put these tools together and what were sort of the models that trained it, so that it can be a more objective and helpful tool. Otherwise, it will be biased, and it might only help a certain group, right? And so I think that's one thing. But AI and or digital tools can also be a way for, as I mentioned earlier, these lesser visible voices of really having having a buy-in for more or greater visibility. Because, I mean, AI is certainly a tool that right now might create, again, sort of a class society, a global class society. Because you've probably heard of Meta and other, or OpenAI, right, with Altman and other CEOs saying like, it's going to revolutionize the whole entire world. People have more access. Well, you know how labor or how energy straining that new technology is. And you also know, for instance, that really require high-speed internet access to run these servers and to run these software tools. And many of you might be coming from developing countries where what really works well is now cell phone technology, right? Barely anyone in these countries has actually hardwired internet. And you also know that in northern hemisphere countries or in Western nations, I mean, fiber optic is sort of the new norm. And so these are the connections that are then used for this technology. And so you see already, again, the gap, the cleavage between the different countries pop up here. And that's really, really problematic in terms of sort of also transitional justice processes. And so I think I'll close here with a couple of thoughts that hopefully will inspire a couple of questions. And I'm looking really forward to a conversation here with you guys. But when you think about this digital space, right? I mentioned earlier art. So our colleague Eliza Garnsey has written about the justice of visual arts. And so she's written about the role of public art, especially, for instance, with the Constitutional Court in South Africa, so the way they display and show art in view of the former apartheid system. And so I think what sort of emotions that evokes and triggers in society and or at the individual level, right? But I think here, technology, when we think about art, can also be very, very important, because if one doesn't have the money to create a monument building is very costly. And it's also very subjective, right? Because even though they might bring together a whole commission of experts that say this is the type of monument that we need in DC, or this is the type of monument that we need here in Tokyo in some central plaza or square, right? And it's like the fact that we have now technology and virtual reality, for instance, or augmented reality, right? Where you put on some glasses or use your cell phone technology to actually then have so these virtual pop-ups. And so there is the memory lab that's run in the US, where they've tried some of these, where for some lesser visible communities, you all of a sudden could create tours. And I've been exploring this with some colleagues also for the lynchings that occurred in North America during the restoration and reconstruction area, right? And so where local communities with these types of technology can create meaningful ways of roping in communities and also outside visitors in a relatively low-cost environment, right? And so it opens up potentials. It comes, of course, with pitfalls and dangers. But I think the last thing that I mentioned here is, and one of our students is working on transitional justice and environmental issues, and think of climate justice, right? So there's also ways in really meaningfully engaging by storytelling, right? And so here technology becomes also yet another vector that could create a meaningful conversation and really bring together folks on a different level that is also multi-layered and very complex. And so I think I could go on for hours and hours and hours. It's my passion, and I wanna strike a conversation with you, though. And so we'll open it up to a conversation here. And so I look forward to your questions and any thoughts or comments you may have. Thank you, everybody.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Arnaud. And as a moderator, I could also probably go on for a very long time, but we only have 15 minutes for questions. So some of the things you might be thinking about is how do you link some of these frameworks to local justice processes or justice processes that you might be familiar with, as opposed to thinking about kind of the transitional justice debate more broadly. Other things you might be thinking about are specific examples or applications of this particular framework, or you might be thinking about kind of like, what about when you talk about narrowness versus broadness in terms of justice and kind of criminal trials, right? The assumption that criminal trials address a recent past, right? You need a living defendant. But many of you come from countries where you might be thinking about legacies of colonialism, right? How do you grapple with injustice when kind of the perpetrators of that injustice might not be alive, right? We might be intergenerationally removed, or you think about in the US context that Arnaud was talking about the legacies of slavery. So kind of with that kind of food for thought, I want to ask first, are there kind of any questions from the group? So these are students who don't necessarily have, some of them have taken classes on transitional justice, right? But not all. Some of them are taking classes on human rights at the moment. Are there questions? So can you raise your hand and then say your name and you go. Oh, so I see 1, 2, there's quite a few. Okay, so we'll make sure that we get as many questions as possible at the time that we have. So I guess we'll start. Nix, you're first.
My name is Nix. I'm a student at Professor Lamont. I was wondering if Justicecraft, especially in the modern age, with the access to AI, would affect one of the criminal trials going on right now with the Philippines past President Duterte, and if that would affect the trial in terms of technology and finding the truth in between facts.
Excellent questions. The question is, how will AI and other technologies impact the Duterte trial potentially before the ICC? Let's collect a few questions and then we'll answer several of them at once. Aisha? Yes.
I'm Aisha. I think my question was, I saw a keyword saying digital protest. So I was wondering, although the digital process is even going on right now, for example, since last week, one more case that has been rising is the Palestine thing. So I feel like, although the digital process is going on, if the countries or whoever is in charge of this shuts down everything completely, then this whole field for the protest is gone. In that case, would this be considered as a good medium for justice?
Okay, so the dangers of digital protests because the digital space can be shut down by the state. Excellent. I guess these are 2 questions, and there were others as well. I guess we'll get to the second round in a second, but let's start with, I guess, Nix's question and then get to the digital protest. So let's see if I can get this.
Thank you so much. Yeah, these are all fascinating questions, and I think remember how I said earlier, AI is both a blessing and a curse, right? And so I think what we always have to keep in mind here, especially with certain human rights trials like at the ICC, for instance, we live in a world where, the governments, especially if they have the monopoly not only over violence, right, and the legitimate or illegitimate violence, if we want to quote here Max Weber, right? And we could also go on in a long discussion what that meant at the time of the post-World War I period. But I think what's really tricky is, and this is why Justicecraft, to answer your question here, can be such a helpful tool, because we're not necessarily through Justicecraft promoting the meaningful human rights idea of universalism, right? As in our declaration for universal human rights, but we're providing a tool here that really helps us better understand, dissect stakeholders, dissect these different layers. And I think in terms of the trial, for instance, for Duterte, I think what's really important is who manipulates why, how, and when. And so trying to assess these layers and really, as a researcher, make it sense of it, right? That means, you can still have the negative consequences, right? Where then Duterte walks free, right? And so, but the Justicecraft model is not necessarily here to say like, this is how we promote positive justice in terms of fairness, equality, but it's a tool that helps us understand why, for instance, the alt-right in the US has such a broad base, and how come they're able to create a discourse that everyone buys into, right? And so I think these are really, really important tools and necessary tools, right? And that ties into the question that you had also in terms of Bangladesh, for instance, right? But any other regime that can really shut down a space. I'm like, whether that is in China, where you only, I'm working on a project right now, we're talking about women's activism, right? Feminism. And so if you look at platforms, and so we're about to submit the results of a manuscript to a publisher, and we've been buying with this idea. It was like, oh, we looked at X, or formerly Twitter, and it was mostly diaspora women in China that use that tool, and so we might get criticized by reviewers saying like, why are you using a tool that only few people use and no one else uses it in China? Because if you go on any other social media platform in China, they can't be critical, right? So it will be basically whitewashed. And so even though you might have less data, it helps you better understand what some of these few activists that are still around can do, and whether they can create some visibility, right? And so they might not necessarily reach the core within the system and try to really affect masses and massive amount of folks, especially women in China. But they reach maybe a few, and this might have a cascading effect for future generations, right? We talked about the transgenerational effects, right? I'm saying for the longest time, when you look at the Franco regime in Spain, right? It was El Gran Silencio. It was sort of like the grandchildren that now dig out and deal with the past, like they go into cemeteries and bring out the remains of the victims, right? And it's not, I mean, not the first generation or second, it's even the third generation victims. And so I think when we're trying to address some of these questions, it's really, really important to not look at cause and effect immediately, even though that's important. I don't want to downplay this, right? It is a risk, it is a danger, but I think we gotta try to understand these broader processes. And if we're talking about a shutdown in terms of a space, right? Are there alternative spaces that might come up, right? What are other opportunities, right? And so I think, and many of our researchers on the Bangladesh projects have also grappled with this, right? And it's like, to what extent is the space physical, right? And do we need to be in the street? And do we need to protest? And are we then overthrowing government? Or to what extent are there other processes? I worked a lot on Egypt in past years. And so once LCZ took over, I'm saying, and we passed a couple laws where people were not publicly allowed to protest anymore. The human rights world, especially these human rights defenders, especially since international NGOs were also not allowed to operate in Egypt anymore. Everyone said, "Nope, that's the end of that's the end of human rights in Egypt." But society continues, right? And so they've created memes. They were really poking fun at LCC through social media, and this was a form of coping, right? And it didn't overthrow the regime. But it was an outlet that allowed folks that were really agitated, that were angry, and that were frustrated, have some sort of visibility. And so I think oftentimes these are these processes, and that's why Justicecraft is such a powerful tool and a framework, right? Where we're not saying this is the theory that people have to follow or use, but it's really a tool where you can start digging and unearthing some of these lesser visible dimensions and spaces where these things happen. Because it's important, and you might open broader communities, but you might also just open up the space for a smaller crowd that then still has a coping mechanism, right? Whether that is sort of the bare knuckles or bare bones approach of surviving, right? Because when you have an outlet, you get through it. Just imagine people in the concentration camps. They were telling themselves stories, or if they were in the concentration camp with their children, they would not lament, oh my gosh, and be frustrated, right? It's like they would really try to think about positive things so that hopefully, if they could only survive and last long enough, they could push that gruesome reality away and think about something more positive, right? And so I think, long story short, though, here is we have to be aware of, let's say, when we go back to technology and AI, the deep fakes, right? The propaganda from sort of these regimes that really, we see it even now in the US. Just take the example of Hillary Clinton at the time and using private email for sort of government work, right? And so the slogan were then the opposition said, like, yeah, we need to lock her up for a crime that she's done. She was not supposed to do this. And just more recently, we have the Secretary of Defense using Signal, a somewhat secure app that the DoD is not using and doesn't have in their protocol, DoD being the Department of Defense. And then the current administration completely downplaying this and saying that, oh, there is no classified information, right? Just imagine that happened under the previous administration, what the response would have been, right? So I mean, this is quite shocking, and so thinking about these different layers is really important, and pointing those out, even though, I mean, the results, right, the end results might not be satisfactory, right? Because in the end, and that's also something, I mean, we didn't really talk about this, but and I don't want to jump into sort of like post-structuralism and postmodernism, but you've all heard of Michel Foucault, right? And sort of this power knowledge. And it's like one of our elements is knowledge, right? But I think we haven't really talked about this power element, right? And so I think that's also something important when you do this analysis and you look at these layers, you want to make sure that you acknowledge the power structure within the space and within the stakeholders, right? And so I think those who have or sit in the driver's seat in terms of like telling and creating that narrative are very, very powerful. They have a lot of responsibility. And I think one historical example is perhaps the story of Peru, right? Where Alberto Fujimori, who really created also, he was the only one, but I mean, he certainly created a political system that repressed the entire opposition. And eventually, Peru and Peruvian society was strong enough to say, no, we don't want this. And they sentenced, with national courts, with a national trial, they sentenced their former president to 25 or 27 years in prison, right? And so, but his support, especially for his daughter, Keiko Fujimori, was so strong that eventually when, I mean, he was locked up, but he was locked up, he was in a mansion, right? I'm saying he was old, he got everything, he had like servants and staff, right? I'm saying he got the news, I'm saying, yeah, yes, he couldn't leave that compound, but I mean, it's like there was a Goriti, I think was the journalist that tried to like write an article on this. He said like he lives in a mansion, a villa. Yes, he can't leave it, but he's old, so why does he have to leave, right? And so again, eventually he was as an amnesty, or they basically commuted him, and so he was free again, right? And so he passed more recently, right? But this powerful movement where his daughter then was able to push and have that revisionist history is quite astonishing. We always think in terms of like progress as linear, but we have to think in terms of dynamic processes that can also flip and do a 180. And so I think that's why it is important to constantly be aware of this and use some of the tools that we hear discussed and elaborated on in order to point to these flaws, right? That doesn't necessarily mean we always have a solution, but I think it's great to create that awareness.
Excellent. I see we've just gone past 6:30. So first of all, thank you again to Arnaud for speaking to us. Experience in Justicecraft and transitional justice and human rights. So I guess with that, we will wrap up for today.